All right, I'm going to start off by just telling a little story, and it's going to involve second person, so you're all in different situations, but we're just going to use our imaginations for a bit so that we can be in this one spot all together. So there's you are in a sedan, you got a sedan in this scenario, and you're driving home from work. And at this point in time, there's no traffic, which is actually a miracle for Phoenix. But you're driving home from work, and there's no traffic, and you're traveling at 65 miles per hour, which also is very slow for Phoenix traffic. But uh, yes, that's the MPH you're traveling at. You're very aware of what's around you. You look and you see a car to your right. You look and you see a car to your left. You're using your rear view mirrors, and so you're aware of your surroundings. Not as aware as like a Waymo, but probably still a better driver. But what you don't realize is up in front, the traffic is slowing down, and you are aware of this. So you slow down with the traffic, and then what happens is a car behind you traveling extremely fast does not see the traffic, and it just slams right into the back of your vehicle. So the last thing you remember is smoke raising from the hood of your car, and everything kind of goes black. So you wake up and you're in the hospital, and the doctor is informing you that you have been paralyzed. Your spine is broken, and you're never going to be able to walk again. So you're kind of questioning to yourself in this scenario, is this God's will? Is this something that God allows? Because this is kind of the question that we're tackling in Job chapter 6. But just as a recap, Job at this point in time, he's lost his children, right? He's lost his house, his possessions. This has all happened, before chapter 6, and he's in physical pain. And so, really quickly, just to get some context, I'm going to go to Job chapter 7, verses 3 through 6, just so that we can see Job crying out and explaining how he's feeling. She says, "The night is long, and I toss and turn till the dawn. My flesh is clothed with worms and dirt. My skin hardens, then breaks out afresh. My days are swifter than a weaver's shuttle, and come to their end without hope." The thing I'm going to emphasize there is that without hope. But we also see the feelings that he's expressing with he's got worms and dirt in him. He's in bad shape. So in chapter 6, Job is actually responding to Eliphaz. And so I'm also going to do a recap of Eliphaz. And so we have to know what Eliphaz said in order to talk about the response that Job has. And Eliphaz, I think a lot of times people throw off the advice because in the end he's rejected by God. God, he not rejected but rebuked by God. But the reality is, all of his advice, or not all of it, but a lot of it, actually comes from biblical origin. It's just applied in the wrong way. He's got this assumption about Job that he's sinning and that he's doing something wrong because of this internal sin. And so I'm gonna go ahead and throw out just a few comments about Eliphaz that we see through what he says in chapter 5. So Eliphaz is actually quoted by Paul in First Corinthians, when Paul says he catches the wise in their craftiness. That's coming from Eliphaz. We also see that Eliphaz's words are very similar to some of the proverbs that we read. I'm going to read two. The first verse is, "My son, do not despise the Lord's discipline or be weary of his reproof. For the Lord reproves him whom he loves, as a father the son in whom he delights." That's verse 1. Then verse 2 is, "Behold, blessed is the one whom God reproves. Therefore despise not the discipline of the Almighty." Do not despise the Lord's discipline. The Lord reproves him whom he loves. There's this commonality between what Eliphaz says and what you see in Proverbs. So even though Eliphaz is rebuked, yeah, the point is that he's coming from this biblical origin. His advice is. He concludes chapter 5 by telling Job to evaluate himself. He goes up to Job and he's just like, "Hey, you've got this internal sin. Go and evaluate yourself." And we actually read Lamentations. That was the verse we read before the sermon, which also, tells you to evaluate yourself. That's also not a bad thing to do. So it's all about his assumptions. It's all about his motives, and everything that he tells Job has just this hidden agenda. He does have a lot of good advice in there too. So in chapter 6, Job is responding to this. Job is responding to Eliphaz, who's accusing him of holding onto this sin. And so I'm going to work through these verses kind of like in small chunks. and I will read them before I talk about them. And so the first verses, of course, will be chapter 6, verses 1 through 3. And then Job answered and said, verses 1 through 3 is what we'll work on first. Job answered and said, "Oh, that my vexation were weighed, and all my calamity laid in the balances, for then it would be heavier than the sand of the sea. Therefore, my words have been rash." Right. So Job is doing what Eliphaz said. He's actually evaluating his calamity. And he's saying, how do I do that? Essentially, he says, you put the sand of the sea on one side, which is his sin. And he said, it's an uncountable amount of weight. And he said, you put my suffering on the other side, and I see my suffering as heavier. It's clearly heavier to me. How do I evaluate my own sin? We can also see this in Job 13:23-24. We see Job say, "How many are my iniquities and my sins?" He's just unaware. How do you know your own sins? We're such sinners. He doesn't know. So he says, "Make me know my transgression, my sin." And he says, "Why do you hide your face and count me as your enemy?" And so that's also something to keep in mind here. That last line, how do you count me as your enemy? Because that's what we're going to be talking about next. That's what Job will see himself as. Job doesn't have verses, as a reminder, like 1 Corinthians 4:17, for this light and momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. He doesn't have James 1:2-4, count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. So Job is figuring these things out on himself. He's working through this, and that's difficult. Um, so then he ends verse 3. He ends verse 3 by saying, it's affecting my speech. He says, my words have been rash. If you take that literally, if you do the literal translation, you'll see it say, my words have been swallowed up. And you still hear that in the South sometimes. It's just, you can't get them back. You can't get his words back. And he's saying, I kind of am able, this is happening because of my suffering. This is a result of it. And when he says that he can't get his words back, he's referencing chapter 3. In chapter 3, you have him cursing the day he was born. So he's just thinking like, well, maybe what I said, wasn't up to par, but, this is happening because in result of my suffering. We can even see this a little bit in our own lives, right? But only to a small extent. Last I saw, I haven't seen a guy with worms and dirt on his hands, but we have, we have colds, we have things that affect us where we don't get a good night's sleep. We're struggling with something that might be on the smaller case, a headache, a cough, something that keeps us awake. We wake up the next morning, we go over to our spouse or, somebody else that a spouse or a friend, and they, you just snap at them. You say, hey, hey, just stop doing that. That's my snap. Yeah. Yeah. I can't come up with a better one right now. So it's too much joint. No, just sorry. Anyway, so that's my snap. And your friend, it's like, hey, what was that? And then you have to say like, oh, I'm sorry, I just didn't get sleep last night. I was up all night. I was struggling because of this terrible headache that I had. So we experience that even now, but Job was experiencing it to the extreme, just much, 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 much worse. Then in verse 4, which is actually one of my favorite verses in this chapter because it totally leads to verses 8-12. Verse 4 is, we see, for the arrows of the Almighty are in me. My spirit drinks of their poison. The terrors of God are arrayed against me. Right. So right off the bat, Job admits something. Job admits that his suffering is coming from God. And at this point in time, we as the reader we know more than Job. Job doesn't know about chapter 1. In chapter 1, that's where the devil comes down. He was roaming around doing his thing on the earth. And then he comes with the heavenly angels, and God suggests to the devil, to hinder Job. In fact, we can go ahead and read that because that verse is so interesting. It's Job 1:8. Right. Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. Right. So it's interesting. Here, Job is said to be blameless and upright, and that's why God chooses him. we're going to dive further into verse 4 because there's so much in this verse. We're going to unpack it one thing at a time. So chapter 6 verse 4, we're first going to talk about the arrows that are coming from God. Job is setting up this picture of Mesopotamian hunting, not specifically that, but when you start digging into the history, the ancient tribes on how they used to hunt, what they would do, they go hunting, and when they hunted larger animals, they dip the arrow into a poison and they'd shoot the animal, and the animal wouldn't die right away. The animal would still be alive, but the poison was taking over, so it wouldn't run. So they didn't have to run after the animal. And so then the hunter would come and they'd kind of finish off the animal. And I believe, and this one, it does get a little bit into history, so I will clarify that. But I believe this is the picture that Job is trying to paint. We see in Job chapter 7:20, if I sin, what do I do to you, you watcher of mankind? Why have you made me your mark? Why have I become a burden to you? So there, Job is admitting that he's being marked by God. He's being hunted by God. And he's even saying, he's starting to question, he's like, I am a burden now. And so there's this idea of Job being hunted. We also see in Lamentations 3:11, it provides a picture also using these arrows. He drew his bow and made me the target of his arrows. And so he feels as if he's being hunted. We also have some other Old Testament references of God's judgment being poured upon people or God's enemies. So we see this idea within the times of people either praying not to receive God's wrath or praying for their enemies to see God's wrath. First in Psalms 38:1-2, the Lord rebuke me not in your anger, nor discipline me in your wrath, for your arrows have sunk into me, and your hand has come down on me. We also see Psalm 64:7-8, but God shoots his arrow at them. They are wounded suddenly. They are brought to ruin with their own tongues, turned against them. All who see them will wag their head. And these descriptions all follow that idea of kind of this hunting, hunting animals. We can also look at the arrows and see that Job's trials came quickly. They came suddenly, one by one. First he loses his house, then he loses his family, one after another, very, very quickly. And so we can make that presumption. But moving on to his spirit, we also see things like potentially a metaphor of God's wrath, because the wrath of God is spreading through him. At least he feels that way. And we also can look and see, hey, Job is saying, I'm being affected internally. Not only is my outside being affected, but now I'm bitter and, I'm struggling. I'm finding my joy. Right. And then to finish it off, we see in verse 4, with the terrors of God are arrayed against me, just another confirmation that he's saying God is waging war against him. You also see the NIV translate that as martial. So you have this militaristic tone, and Job is fighting that concept. He's kind of exploring it, but also fighting it. At the same time, he's also explaining this to Eliphaz, but a lot of this I think he's taking internally because he's processing. We then get into this bridge in 5-7. So verses 1-3 are kind of exploring this idea of God's justice. And God's justice is being applied throughout the whole first half, and honestly the second half too, but we're only talking about the first half. And then we see verse 4, and verse 4 is kind of the opening where he's saying, hey, God is waging war against me, and it's consuming me, and that's how I feel. And then we get into 5-7 where there's this bridge of him talking about his contentment. He's talking about his contentment in life and how he's striving to be content, but he's not able to be. And he looks at the ox, the field, and we'll read that right now. Does the wild donkey bray when he has grass, or the ox low over his fodder? So he's looking at these animals and he's saying, when they have food, they're content. And so he's struggling. He's like, why is there this middle ground, that I can meet? And we can kind of see this idea. We see this idea in Proverbs 30:8b-10. The proverb author says, give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food that is needful for me, lest I be full and deny you and say, who is the Lord? Or lest I be poor and steal and profane the name of my God. So while in this Proverbs, he's talking about riches, he's talking about, this struggle between being too wealthy and too poor. It still, I think, applies to Job's scenario, because Job is having this struggle, but with health. he doesn't want to profane God's name. He doesn't want to deny God's name. And later he says, that's my comfort. And so then he says, but I'm struggling glorifying your name in my current state. So then all that leads to the saltless food. Me and my roommate are always having a battle because I don't like salt in anything, and he likes salt in everything. Too much salt, in my opinion. But in the Bible, salt is very important, and so I have to actually, settle down and admit that salt is flavor, and it's used as flavor almost every time it's referenced. And I kind of think that that's because they just package it and everything because they didn't have refrigeration. But it is said to be flavor, and that is the analogy that they often give. So in this instance, salt is flavorful, and it brings out the food. And so that's the bridge right there. It's kind of the bridge ending. He's questioning his contentment. And then what does he say? He says, my appetite refuses to touch them. They are as food that is loathsome to me. And then in verse 6, we're kind of going backwards. Can that which is tasteless be eaten without salt? Or is there any taste in the juice of the mallow? Right. So just as a recap, he's suffering. He's being hunted by God. He's got this poison, God's wrath in him. He's unable to move. He's getting inflicted with trials over and over again. The arrows are coming at him. And so he's saying, there's no joy, there's no hope. I'm hopeless, I'm joyless. What do I do? My life has no flavor. Right. And so he does use that the fruit juice of the mallow. And honestly, I looked that up and that is a word they don't actually know what it means. And so they assume that it's kind of this is flavorless. That's kind of the assumption. Then in verse 7, he's kind of coming up with a solution. My appetite refuses to touch them. There is food that is loathsome to me. And so we can even read in Job 10:1 his state that for the saltless food, I loathe my very life. Therefore, I will give free rein to my complaint and speak out in the bitterness of my soul. Right. If you ever want to see somebody be bold with God, read Job 10 because he is very, very bold. He definitely speaks out his complaint. He loathes his life, and so his solution really comes down in verses 8 through 10. So I'm going to read them as a whole. He says, oh, that I might have my request, and that God would fulfill my hope, that it would please God to crush me, that he would let loose his hand and cut me off. This would be my comfort. I would even exalt in pain unsparing, for I have not denied the words of the Holy One. So in verses 8 and 9, he's saying, I'm being hunted, and God, if you're my enemy, then what options do I have? Please let it please you to kill me because I can't deny you. He's in that state of I can't run. You know where I go. And so what good is my life? Am I here for you to just keep shooting me with arrows? What am I to do? And that's what he asked for. That's what he asked God. And my life. Job has a similar attitude as Paul. It's just kind of different because Paul um, is not in a state that Job is in. I mean, oftentimes Job is persecuted, but in Job's case, he's seeing God clearly as his enemy, and he's trying to figure out what do I do if God is my enemy. Whereas in Paul, he has a clear recognition that God is on his side. And so we're going to step aside. I'm going to read some of Paul's verses. One is Philippians 1:20, where Paul shares his mentality on his suffering, where it says, but that with full courage, now as always, Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or by death. To live is Christ, to die is gain. We see 1 Corinthians 5a, yes, we are of good courage, and we would rather be away from the body and at home with the Lord. So whether we at home or away, we make it our aim to please him. So even though Job is suffering with God being his enemy, he has the right idea. He's saying he's still seeking God's pleasure in his death. He's still saying, God, I can't kill myself. I want it to be your pleasure. I just don't know how to glorify you right now. I just don't know how to glorify you. I don't know how to have joy. So help me. Um, he's just feeling very much so that God is his enemy. In verses 11 through 12, we see that Job is losing strength. So we're seeing some of these things repeated. And in Job, in Job 6, 11 through 12, right? He's asking God, he's saying, he's asking Eliphaz, but also I think God. I think at this point we're kind of at an aside where he's explaining to Eliphaz, but I think these are prayers that he's prayed before. I don't think this is completely to Eliphaz. He says, in 11, what is my strength that I should wait? What is my end that I should be patient? Is my strength the end, strength of stones, or my flesh bronze? He uses these metals, and we see them used throughout the Bible. And what's interesting is they can be strong in certain contexts and weak in other contexts. And like for instance, in Daniel, God's kingdom is stone, and it actually crushes what are considered more valuable metals. And so there's a lot of debate as to what Job means by bringing up these metals. And I'm not even entirely sure myself, so I'm not actually going to guess. But he's just emphasizing the fact he's ready to die. He doesn't see a way out, and he's losing strength. He sees the end near. He's an animal. God's wrath is consuming him as poison, as he used in that metaphor. He sees the end is near. I haven't denied you. That's what gives me comfort. So please, God, just before I deny you, because I'm worried about it, please end my life. So to conclude, we're going to return to the story in the beginning, when you were driving on the I-10 at a reasonable amount, and it's actually probably why you got crushed from behind, but we won't think about that. Anyways, we left off right where we questioned, you're questioning to yourself, is this God's will, right? Does God allow suffering? And the absolute answer is yes. And society today protects God from suffering, but that's not at all what we should do because God is very involved in our suffering. Job recognized right off the bat that God was shooting those arrows at him without knowing that the devil was involved at all. And so when we have suffering, we have to change our mindset of instead of seeing it as, coming from not God or coming from the devil, it's coming from God. And God uses the devil as a tool for your blessing. I'm going to be as bold to say that. And so that's the way we should think. I'm going to start throwing a bunch of verses at you because this is the best way to conclude. My students, when I teach at GCU, always say, you never know how to end. So I'm just going to throw a bunch of verses at you. So James 5:11 is, behold, we consider those blessed who remain steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job. So Job's story was used. He fought through his suffering and he was used despite at a moment in time thinking that God was his enemy, right? This is that point in time and questioning God in Job 10, being bold. When you have a complaint, Job had a complaint, that's where you should bring it. You bring it to God. So that you don't bring it to your friend. So Job was rewarded also spiritually. We can look at Romans 5. Suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character. Character produces hope, and hope does not put us to shame because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us and formed into a weapon. So in Isaiah 54:16, it says, behold, I have created the smith who blows the fire of coals and produces a weapon for its purpose. So I'm also going to be as strong to say that you're a weapon. And these aren't biblically accurate. We've got a sword. You see how different these are, though? Like, we've got a slingshot, and this works long range. This works close range. And God, first we'll say people make them different ways. They take different lengths to create, and they take a different amount of, refining or whittling, whatever it is. In David's time, the sling would have been more like. Anyways, we have these two different weapons, two different shapes. And so, of course, they're going to be formed differently. We can see that Joseph had to suffer in order to save Israel from starvation and also Egypt. And it even gets better than that. I'm going to read it straight. When he summoned a famine on the land, he meaning God, and broke all supply of bread, he had sent a man ahead of them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. His feet were hurt with fetters. His neck was put in a collar of iron until what he said came to pass. The word of the Lord tested him. God sent the famine first, and then he perfected Joseph ahead of time so that he could be in that position to save Israel and Egypt from starvation because he was the second right-hand man of Pharaoh. All right. Job thought he was God's enemy, and that's what he was exploring, the idea he was exploring. He felt like God's wrath was in him. He felt like it was the end. And he felt like God wasn't there, or really he was too much there. There's different verses where Job is saying, God, you're absent. And then other verses where he's saying, stop attacking me. So, there's this kind of, mix in the book of Job. Joe painted a picture of how he felt for Eliphaz, and he was using a language that he could understand. We looked at the verses in Isaiah, we looked in the verses in Psalm, where individuals, when something went wrong, attributed that suffering to God, and then even prayed, "Don't pour your wrath on me." Really, it comes down to there was one man who didn't deserve suffering, who was completely innocent. This man was Jesus, and he was put on a cross, and he took all of God's wrath for us. Right? Let me get the gospel message in here. And so that, we don't have to experience God's wrath, that we are not God's enemy. Isaiah 53:10a, goes as far to say that it was the will of God to crush him. All right. Let me pray really quick.